Hello everybody. So today I'm going to speak a little bit about Jungian psychology. As always, a slight disclaimer right in the beginning. I myself am not a psychologist or a therapist. So if you are looking actually for somebody who can help you with some therapy or some psychological advice, that's probably not now the video to watch. However, I always make the connection to leadership. That's where I'm the expert in. And I think Jungian psychology is very interesting for leadership. I'm a bit astonished, to be honest with you, that Jung has not taken up much more space within leadership literature and research and theory development. It's completely mind-boggling that this has not been the case, because the Jungian view on the psyche is so helpful when it comes to dealing with real problems and with giving you a pathway to understand yourself better. It's very hands-on, in fact. So there is no real explanation for this, except perhaps that for some people it might seem too much connected to the spiritual ideas, but to be honest, even something like spiritual leadership now exists, or leadership which orients more towards spiritual practice, and we'll get to that point also sometime later. I myself find that very interesting, but one has to find a certain kind of balance between the material world and the immaterial, so things which go on in the psyche, things which concern ourselves in a spiritual sense, and very practical things. So that's my reservation towards this topic of spiritual leadership or spirituality in leadership, is that, as we know, the workplace and organizations and hierarchies are not something taken lightly. They can be rather unpleasant, and also the conflicts can be very unpleasant. And at times it does not seem a very spiritual place, or where you could make any arguments using spirituality. Nonetheless, spirituality has its place, but within a certain context. And that's why I always use the term art. I see leadership as an art form, and art always has a certain spiritual component to it, but it's still very much connected to the here and now and to material aspects and decision makings and interacting with the material world and creating something. That's why I'm not so much on the side of those who declare leadership a pure spiritual issue, although I empathize with that, and I think that there is some importance there. Now back to Jungian psychology. It could be that there's some reservations because especially from the side of the psychology group who study psychology and then go into leadership, that there is an anti-Jung bias because he has built that bridge from psychology into spirituality, and that's why they disregard him. But in terms of leadership, that's a big mistake. It's a huge mistake. If you look at his work on alchemy, it's very interesting. Now, those who are not really so much into Jungian psychology and now even hear alchemy, you might be tempted to not watch the video any further. That's quite understandable, but let me just say a couple of words on the topic of alchemy. What I find very interesting is that Jung claims that alchemy is actually a therapeutic process which the alchemists did experience while conducting alchemy. So there's a material side to alchemy, which is the chemical part, which is dealing with all these substances and how they could be merged or separated and so on and so forth. And there's another part to it, which is the psychological aspect to alchemy, and that is the part which Jung was interested in. And he was trying to prove, or actually did prove, that alchemy is primarily a psychological process with a spiritual aim. So all that, just a little bit of background on Jung. Again, I'm not a Jung expert, but I think there is a lot of good things in Jung. Just if you take the alchemical part of his studies, it's interesting because it deals with this interaction with the material world, and leadership does that all the time. And it's mind-boggling why Jungian psychology, as I've just said 2 or 3 times, but I got to repeat myself, is not taken more into account. Today we're going to look a little bit at one of his very prominent or at a very prominent Jungian, Edward Edinger, who wrote several books, very good books about Jungian psychology, excellent commentary on Jung, on some of his books. So it's good to read Jung, and it's good also then to read Edinger to understand Jung better, because Jung can be at times difficult to digest. There was a certain stage in his life where I believe he was not so interested anymore in making himself understood. So he just wrote the way he felt, or what he perceived to be right, and he didn't explain himself anymore. So it needed people like Edinger to actually to translate a little bit of what Jung was talking about, and he's doing an excellent job, and he's an excellent representative of Jungian ideas, and also can verbalize these quite well. At another video I'll go more into Jung. There are some interviews with Jung, unfortunately not a lot, which is also strange that people like that have not been interviewed more just for the sake of historical documentation. There was a series of interviews with Dr. Edward Edinger, which is also not representative of his work at all. And the clips which I'm going to show are just also a sample of his work. It's not representative of his work at all. You would have to start really reading his things. But I'm taking just some examples of Jungian psychology and showing how they are really so central for the subject of leadership. So this is the aim of this video. Again, I cannot represent Jungian psychology at all in this short time period, and I won't do it justice, but I'm just going to pick out some examples from Jungian psychology to make a point how they relate to leadership. So let's do that. Let's look into, as I said before, an interview with Edward Edinger on aspects of Jungian psychology, and then I will comment them.
Then the question of the persona. What value is awareness of the persona to the individual and society? Here again, as with all self-knowledge, both the individual and society benefit. You see, it commonly happens that to a greater or lesser extent, an individual is identified with this persona. It's so convenient. It's hard enough to acquire competence in a professional career. And once that has been achieved, the satisfactions of that achievement are often so significant that there's a strong tendency for the individual then to identify with the professional persona that one learns in the course of his professional training. So the minister learns his persona as he goes through theological seminary and then starts his first job as an assistant pastor. The medical student learns the medical persona. The lawyer learns his, and so on. And once that's learned, it makes things work so smoothly to operate out of it that there's a strong tendency to identify with it. But the trouble is, for society as a whole, that when one meets one's doctor or one's pastor or one's lawyer or whatever, one isn't meeting a full human being. You meet the mask. And I'll speak for my own profession. I won't belittle any other profession that I don't know, but I can tell you that it's a real problem in the medical profession. Doctors are very busy, and it takes too much time to be real. It's much easier to function out of your medical persona. And the great advantage of it, the temporary advantage, is it's like skating on a pond of frozen ice. It doesn't take any effort. You don't have to respond out of deeper human realities, and you can get a lot more work done in a day. You see, you can see more patients. If you take time to listen to them and respond to them humanly, you get caught up and you get way behind in your schedule. That's all understandable, but if self-knowledge is to proceed, and if individuals are going to achieve full, well-rounded human potentiality, it's important for them to discover the reality of the persona and the fact that it's not identical with the ego, and that if they choose to identify with it now and then, they are diminishing themselves both psychologically and humanly. And once those things become known, then the initial identification is broken. And even though one may have to operate out of that persona at times, then you know what you're doing. And it makes a world of difference whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously, because choice is involved.
He already said it really all, didn't he? So I really like what he said at the end, that it's important to become aware of the persona and then to be able to make a conscious choice if you're acting out of your persona or not. I think that's really, really excellent what he's saying there at the end. And again, I don't understand why this is not standard teaching practice within leadership development. Because what Dr. Edinger just said there, and he even gave some examples that he says, you, as a lawyer, as a doctor, and then he went into how doctors develop the doctor persona, is so absolutely true. And it, of course, goes also towards leadership. So there are still some social agreement on what we would like people who lead appear as. So there's a social contract around that, or people who appear as a doctor or a mayor, etc., how they should appear. And if this does not meet our expectations, then we are also quite disappointed and mistrustful of these people. So persona sort of cuts two ways, doesn't it? On one hand, we train to become a professional, and part of that being a professional is then having that persona of this professional, of seeming confident of what we're doing, of talking a certain fact-based language, in not involving our emotions too much in our decision-making process. Could be a number of things. And on the other hand, we expect that also from certain professions. So we would like to see the mayor in his or her function as a mayor and not as a private individual with all her quirks and neurotic behavior and her personal statements. So especially in politics, where every word counts, there's this politician persona which speaks in a very measured way and is very skilled in communicating certain messages because everything is really scrutinized. So, but at the end, again, Dr. Edinger makes a point. It's not necessarily that he condemns this aspect of persona. It's more that to become aware of it and then also to be able to make a conscious decision. And for leadership, this is so very important. Of course, also for other professions, but in the case of leadership, it is again this confrontation with complexity and chaos, which I think is rather unique in that area. Perhaps, I'm not saying, again, there's all sorts of exceptions to a rule, but perhaps in certain professions you could go through life just using your persona to do your job in the best possible way, and that would be absolutely fine. In leadership, it becomes very, very difficult to do that, and I would also claim even more difficult to do that in the future, simply because, as we know from people working in this field and from literature in general, that the complexity is just mounting and mounting and mounting. Now, why is this a problem in terms of persona? It's fairly simple. So a persona is a set of fixed ideas around how to appear in that professional environment, what habits, behavior, traits you should display to be accepted within that professional environment, and to be respected and to be heard. So it's this set of ideas and traits and behaviors and characteristics is fairly fixed, no? So it's not very flexible, and you train very hard to acquire them and to control that persona, to wear it, as Edinger says, like a mask. So you just show a certain aspect of yourself, the other part you don't show. And you use that persona, that mask, to interact professionally with your environment. So far, so good. However, if the environment which you're working in changes to such a degree that the persona is not enough to deal with it, with this environment, then you're in trouble, because then you don't know what to do anymore. You cling on to the persona as a means to cope with the situation, because you have learned that's how you cope with the situation. You use the persona to solve that problem in front of you, to solve that complexity. However, if it is exhausted itself, if it doesn't serve that purpose anymore, then what you experience is a crisis, a real professional crisis, because you have not been taught any other way to deal with that situation, with that complexity, and you will experience the death of the persona, basically, the uselessness of the persona. And also that goes along with all sorts of negative feelings, with a lot of anxiety, depression, all these things, because you have identified yourself and your professional life so much with this trained and learned aspect of persona that you cannot make that choice, as Dr. Edinger points out in the end. So I guess what I'm saying here, it's good to become aware of that, what is expected of you in a certain social setting, in a certain professional setting, but also to become aware of that's not you, and that's not even all you have to give in terms of this professional setting. You will also experience, and I think a lot of you have, a professional setting where people are just tired of people wearing those masks, and where it becomes a cliche and a burden for those involved, who says, I'm tired of that. I get bored just seeing those paper people, as Fritz Perls coins them. So people have just a paper mask, or have this two-dimensional, unauthentic personality, and just display this professional persona. So some people also get exhausted just through that, and they appreciate also authentic personalities, where they can feel that there's somebody behind that, or there's something coming out of that, or there's a person in front of you who does not wear that mask anymore because he or she doesn't need to. There's an authentic interest in this work. There's an interest being carried by values in this work to achieve something with this work. And then you find a lot of people actually relieved by encountering people like that, because they thought, well, it's only those mask-wearing people who run around. No, there's still some people left who really care deeply. So that to the aspect of persona. Again, an aspect which should be standard curriculum material in leadership development, just to give people choice, and also to make them aware that more or less somewhere in the future there could be a crisis, most likely if you cling too much to this persona idea, because it will exhaust itself sooner or later within leadership. That's basically like a natural law. It will happen.
Then turning to the next item, the shadow. What's the social advantage of being aware of the shadow? I can tell you it's immense. Because as long as one is unconscious of the shadow, there's almost infallibly, it gets projected. It gets projected onto somebody that provides some hook, some quality that maybe only in small degree that corresponds to the nature of one's own shadow. And then when that happens, the projector has the delightful experience of locating evil. It's out there in you, and now I know what to attack in order to make the world a better place. And so, in lesser shadow projections, I guess no great harm is done. It's an abrasion in the general mechanics of ordinary human relationships. But once it starts operating on a large collective scale, shadow projection can be disastrous. And I hardly need to spell out the examples of it, because they're everywhere to be seen, where you've got one faction opposing another faction and attributing dark, evil, if not diabolical, implications on the enemy faction. We see this everywhere in the world, and I'm not going to go into the details, but this is all the consequence of shadow projection. And it's really a disgrace for an educated and supposedly relatively mature human being to be caught engaging in a crude shadow projection in this day and age. But disgrace or not, it happens all the time. And it's a grave damage to our social fabric. So to the extent that an individual, through the analytic process, becomes aware of his shadow, he is then inoculated from shadow projection, because he recognizes that the particular quality or idea or mode of living that is so annoying to him in the other person is an expression of his own shadow, which accounts for the annoyance. We can have likes or dislikes, but when a certain level of affect enters the picture, that's an infallible indication of a shadow projection. And people unconscious of their shadows are a grave danger to the welfare of society as a whole.
And I would add, leaders who are unaware of their shadow are a grave annoyance or danger to the people around them. Another aspect of Jungian psychology, which should be standard teaching material, is the shadow. Now, the concept of shadow is, I wouldn't call it difficult, but sometimes difficult to understand, let's put it this way. And I will try to explain it a little bit differently and maybe not in line completely with Jungian psychology or Jungian ideas. But I call this the rise of the antagonist within leadership. So there is this moment, or there are these moments, where certain people get under your skin. And as Dr. Edinger points out, they don't just get under your skin and annoy you, they stir up deep emotions, deep feelings of anger, of hatred, of impatience, of, you get those situations where you start thinking about them, obsessing over them all the time. And again, in work and leadership especially, it's more likely to happen because you're confronted with a lot of people, a lot of different kinds of people. So it will be very, very likely that you will meet that person which will you be pointing at, because that person is creating all those feelings within you. And usually I think in terms of coaching, that's what coaches have to work with a lot, is that type of conflict and that type of problem where people, leaders point at some people they're working with and saying, this person is just not doing what I want her to do, and she's annoying me, and they start to just circulate around that relationship and why it's not working and why all these emotions keep emerging. That's what I call the rise of the antagonist. It's something, again, it's like a natural law. It will happen. It happens to everybody. And what's behind that, according to my own analysis, is quite simple. You go into the world as somebody who wants to shape the world, right? Especially if you're in leadership, if you're in a position of responsibility, that's why you do that. You want to shape reality just like an artist shapes art. And because of that, what enables you to do that is a set of values which you believe in. You believe in certain aspects of yourself, which you bring up to the forefront, and most likely, I'm just assuming that's the kind of person you are, these are values which you perceive as positive. So hardworking, being on time, believing to be truthful, believing in treating everybody the same, believing in your profession, whatever that might be, that you say this is what the world needs, all these things. So you have a set of beliefs, you have a set of values, which you capitalize on and which you, of course, use to construct that reality. Now, that's a good thing. So to have values is something good, and it's even better if you become conscious of them. So not just externalize them, but really start to reflect on them and perhaps have somebody to help you to reflect on them. However, what happens automatically, and what most people don't realize, is that you reject the opposite side of that value, right? Because you have to put something in the forefront which you deem positive, let's say being truthful, which means, of course, that lying or not telling the truth is something you reject. And this rejection of certain aspects which you also have of yourself. So every person knows how to lie, and every person has lied for whatever reason. It doesn't matter. That's just the human nature. We're not just this one thing, we're also the other thing. But for the sake of achieving something, you say, I reject to lie. I don't like that. I believe that's wrong, especially in leadership. I don't want that. But it's still within you. So it becomes part of that shadow personality. It becomes something which is suppressed for the advantage of these other values. Now, it might be you meet somebody, so you're creating this future based on these values, and then in your work you meet somebody else. Now, this person might also have talent or merit. I'm not saying this is a bad person. And I'm not saying that this person is a liar, but perhaps this person believes that sometimes the ends justify the means, so sometimes you should lie. So he looks at you and says, this is a naive person. He believes always that the truth is necessary, but sometimes you have to be cunning. Sometimes you have to tell white lies. And he or she actually does that to achieve some ends. Now, this is something which provokes the shadow within you, and this stirs up these negative emotions and this anger. and you start pointing at the other person saying, you are evil, you're wrong, the way you are doing it, the way you're constructing the future, that is wrong. So that's what I call the rise of the antagonist. The antagonist rises in a sort of miraculous fashion. And that's why you always have the same conflicts over and over and over again. Something you will notice even during your work. It's strange. It's again the same conflict, again the same conflict. So not to become aware of the shadow, not to become aware of the rise of the antagonist, not to be able to integrate these antagonistic values into your own value system just creates problems for yourself, because either you have to deny it, you have to go into complete denial, or you start obsessing over these antagonists, or they start to beat you because you're helpless. You don't know how to deal with them in any appropriate manner. You just become very emotional, which I absolutely understand. But in terms of leadership development, yeah, of course, you need to know all these things to overcome those problems. Again, as an example, I was dealing with a manager, and she was very annoyed at a person, and he was not on time. He didn't work very hard, and she was complaining about him to me, and I was just trying to dig deeper and trying to say, but why? Okay, I understand all that, but why are you annoyed? And that's the only interesting question. So what I think you can work on this yourself, on the shadow. Every time you're annoyed or you find yourself really like this person is getting under my skin, ask yourself why. And don't look at ask yourself, why am I annoyed? Not at what the other person is doing wrong, but where are these feelings coming from? Why do I feel so strongly about that? And most likely it's because you're in denial, or you're not accepting that you yourself carry those qualities within you. Just like this manager didn't accept that she's carrying these qualities of being lazy and wanting to be late also in her. Because if she would accept that, it wouldn't matter to her. She would just say, okay, this is a lazy person. He doesn't want to be on time. He doesn't want to work hard. Move on. I have bigger things to do. I have bigger fish to fry. Okay, so that was just a short video on C.G.Jung, Edinger, and leadership. Again, it's not exhaustive about Jung. I was just giving a short glimpse about some concepts which I think are so central to leadership. And for some reason, I don't know, they hardly appear. Maybe in some literature and some trainings they appear, but they should not just appear somewhere. They should be a standard leadership development practice, because it happens to everyone. So I hope you enjoyed the video a little bit, and see you in the next one.